Time has a way of marking us all. It traces lines around the eyes, turns hair to silver, and slowly reshapes the face into a map of every year we've lived. Each of us becomes a walking record of our own existence, our bodies bearing witness to the seasons we've weathered and the moments we've gathered along the way. But imagine, if you can, a face that refuses to follow this law. A face frozen in time, caught in an endless spring, while the rest of the world moves forward into autumn. A quiet and deeply unsettling contradiction that whispers of something terribly wrong. A mystery so disturbing it would haunt the sleepy corners of a small Alabama town, leaving everyone to wonder whether they were witnessing a miracle or something far more sinister. Before we go further into the story of Nora Vance, if you're new to the Fear Sermon, take a moment to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let us know what state or country you're listening from. Now let's step into Harwick, Alabama, and into a mystery that would shake that town to its core. Harwick in the year 1871 wasn't a place of grand ambition or busy streets. It was a town still catching its breath, still nursing the deep and festering wounds left by a war that had torn the nation apart, especially here in the South. The air itself seemed to carry the faint sting of ash and defeat, mixing with the heavy sweetness of magnolias and the constant dust kicked up by wagon wheels on unpaved roads. The Civil War had ended 6 years earlier, but its shadow still stretched long and cold over Harwick, touching every family, every field, every soul who lived there. The men who had marched off in gray uniforms had returned, if they returned at all, with hollow eyes and silences that spoke of things they could never put into words. Their bodies were often broken, their spirits scarred beyond repair. The women who had kept everything going with dwindling supplies and endless worry now faced a future that felt foreign and impossibly grim. Cotton still ruled the land here, fields stretching out under the brutal Alabama sun, their white bowls promising a prosperity that rarely reached the common farmer. Sharecropping had become the new way of life for many, a cycle of debt that simply swapped one kind of servitude for another. The freed men and women, newly emancipated, walked a treacherous path between hope and deep-seated prejudice, their dreams too often crushed by the harsh realities of Reconstruction. Racial tensions simmered beneath the polite surface of daily life, sometimes boiling over in quiet cruelties or open intimidation, an unsettling hum that never quite went away. The town itself was a modest scattering of clapboard houses, most in need of repair, their paint peeling like skin burned by too much sun. A single dusty main street held a general store with shelves that were rarely full, though the owner, old Mr. Abernathy, always had time for gossip or a sympathetic ear. There was a blacksmith whose hammer rang out a steady rhythm through the quiet afternoons, and a small post office where letters from distant family were awaited with a mixture of hope and dread, often bringing news of hardship rather than good fortune. At the heart of Harwick, both in location and spirit, stood the First Baptist Church, its steeple reaching toward the sky like a hand raised in prayer. On Sundays, the pews filled with townsfolk seeking comfort, guidance, and a sense of belonging through the fiery words of Reverend Tate, whose voice could roar like a summer storm or soothe like a gentle breeze depending on what sins he believed needed addressing. The roads were mostly dirt, turning to thick mud during the spring rains and baking into cracked, dusty paths under the oppressive summer heat. The sounds here were simple ones, cattle lowing in the distance, crickets singing at dusk, the occasional whinny of a horse, voices drifting from front porches, and always the buzz of flies. The smells told their own story too: damp earth after rain, wood smoke from cooking fires, the cloying sweetness of honeysuckle. and the sharp tang of sweat from those laboring under the sun. Life was hard here, unyielding and deeply rooted in tradition. Change came slowly if it came at all, and anything out of the ordinary was watched closely, discussed endlessly, and usually feared. It was into this world that Elias Vance and his daughter Nora made their home. Their place, a 2-story farmhouse, sat about a mile outside the main part of Harwick, tucked among a small grove of ancient oak trees. It had once been a handsome house, built with care and pride, but now it wore a coat of faded gray paint and an air of quiet neglect, as if it too was mourning alongside its owner. Elias Vance was a man shaped by the war, a former Confederate officer who had come back from the battlefields of Virginia forever changed. He stood tall and gaunt, with a jaw cut sharp and eyes that seemed always in shadow, even under the brightest sun. His hair, once a rich brown, was now streaked with gray and pulled back neatly from a high forehead. He moved with a stiff, almost military precision, his shoulders always squared, his gaze direct but never inviting. In public, Elias said very little. When he came to town for supplies, his buggy rattling along the dusty road, he handled his business with a quiet efficiency that discouraged small talk. He paid what he owed on time, nodded briefly to those he passed, and offered only the shortest pleasantries. People respected him from a distance, wary of his stillness, but they also respected what he had given in the war and the way he carried his grief without complaint. Everyone knew he had lost his wife Clara during those war years, a loss that seemed to have hollowed him out completely, leaving only the shell of the man he had once been. At home, though, the silence inside the Vance farmhouse was something else entirely. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was a silence born of control, so tight it felt like it might suffocate you. Elias kept to strict routines, almost like rituals. He would wake before dawn, tend his small patches of cotton and corn, then come back inside to make breakfast for Nora. She was his only child, a wisp of a girl, small for her age with delicate features and hair the color of moonlight. Her eyes, though, they were what stayed with you. A deep, knowing blue that seemed to hold something ancient, maybe even something sad. She moved through the house without sound, her steps barely touching the worn floors. Her voice when she spoke was soft, barely more than a breath, as if she was afraid of disturbing the fragile peace her father worked so hard to maintain. Nora was, by any measure, a well-behaved child. Too well-behaved, some might have whispered if they had dared to say it out loud. Her clothes were always neat and clean, her hair perfectly braided. She filled her days reading the few books Elias owned or drawing in a worn notebook, her small hands moving with a gentle grace. She hardly ever played outside, and when she did, it was always within the boundaries of the Vance property. Always under the watchful eye of her father. The people of Harwick saw her as a quiet, almost ghost-like child, a fragile bloom struggling to survive in a harsh world. They pitied her for losing her mother and for the somber life she led with her withdrawn father. They saw a girl who might be a little sickly, but otherwise unremarkable. They did not yet see the unsettling truth that was slowly beginning to show itself, a truth that would tear apart the quiet surface of the Vance household and expose a darkness no one in Harwick was ready to face. The first shadow, faint and barely noticeable at first, began to grow in the spring of 1875. 4 years had passed since the war ended. 4 years since Nora Vance had last been seen as a child of 10. By the calendar, she should have been 14 now, on the edge of womanhood, her body starting to show the changes that marked the shift from girl to young lady. But Nora, to the increasingly sharp eye of Mabel Prout, stayed stubbornly, unnervingly the same. Mabel Prout was a woman built for watching. Her eyes, though often narrowed in suspicion, missed almost nothing. She was a regular at the general store, her basket always full of the week's necessities, her ears always open to whatever gossip was floating through town. She had known Nora since the girl was born, had watched her learn to walk, and then grow into that quiet, pale child. But somewhere along the way, the growing had simply stopped. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, hot and sticky, the kind of day that makes the air feel thick and heavy. Mabel saw Nora in town that day. Elias had brought her along, as he sometimes did, to pick up a spool of thread or a small bag of seeds. Nora stood beside her father, a silent, almost see-through figure in a simple calico dress. Her hair, still that same moonlight color, hung in a braid down her back, and her face, framed by little wisps that had escaped, was smooth, untouched by time, and completely childlike. Mabel watched her for a long moment, then glanced at her own daughter Sarah, who was a year younger than Nora. Sarah was all long limbs and new curves now, her voice starting to deepen, her face breaking out in the occasional spot. She was growing, changing, moving into adolescence the way nature intended. But Nora was not. Her height looked exactly the same as it had 2, even 3 years ago. Her hands were still small, her wrists thin as bird bones. Her chest remained flat, her hips narrow. It was as if time had simply looked away and forgotten her. Mabel felt something cold move through her, starting in her stomach and spreading out until it reached her fingers. It wasn't just that Nora looked young. It was that she looked exactly the same features, the same wide blue eyes, the same unsettling stillness. Like something preserved in a jar, untouched by the normal passing of years. That evening, as the crickets began their nightly song, and the air finally offered a small break from the day's heat, Mabel sat on her porch, swing-fanning herself with a palmetto fan. Her husband Thomas, a kind but often distracted man, sat beside her whittling a piece of cedar. "Thomas," Mabel started, her voice low. "Did you see Nora Vance in town today?" Thomas grunted, his knife carving a thin curl from the wood. "Saw her with Elias at the store. Quiet as always. She's not growing, Thomas." Mabel's voice had an edge to it now, a certainty that didn't invite argument. "She's 14 years old, and she looks no older than 10, maybe 11 at the most." Thomas paused, looking up at his wife with a wrinkled brow. "Now, Mabel, you know girls grow at their own pace. Some are just late bloomers." "This isn't about late blooming," Mabel insisted, her fan going still. "This is something else. I've seen enough children grow up in this town to know what's natural and what isn't." Her face, her size, everything about her. It's like she's stuck, frozen somehow. Thomas shrugged, being a practical man. "Elias keeps her pretty close. Maybe she just isn't getting enough sun or proper food. He's always been strange, that one, ever since Clara passed." Mabel made a sound of disbelief. "It's more than that. It's a feeling, Thomas. A cold feeling I can't shake." The next day, that feeling turned into something solid. At the dry goods store, while looking at bolts of fabric, Mabel ran into Mrs. Henderson, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper observations. "Mabel, have you seen Nora Vance lately?" "Mrs." Henderson whispered, leaning in close, her eyes moving around the nearly empty store. Mabel straightened up, a flicker of something like satisfaction crossing her face. "I did, just yesterday. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. She hasn't changed a bit, has she?" Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice dropping even lower. "My Martha is only a year older, and she already has boys hanging around. But Nora, she's still just a child. A little doll, a doll that doesn't age." Mabel finished, and despite the heat, a shiver ran down her spine. It's not right. It's just not right. Once that seed of suspicion took root, it spread fast. The women of Harwick, with their sharp eyes and even sharper tongues, started to notice things. At church, during the few times Nora was there, whispers would move through the pews like wind through dry leaves. "She's so small for her age. Looks exactly like she did 3 years ago. Poor thing, always so pale." The whispers weren't meant to be cruel, not at first anyway. But they carried something underneath them, a fear of what they couldn't explain. Reverend Tate, a man who understood the mood of his congregation better than almost anyone, could feel the shift happening. He saw the glances toward the Vance pew, heard the uneasy murmurs. He knew something was troubling his flock, something that didn't fit the natural order of things. So on the following Sunday, his sermon took a darker turn. His voice, usually strong and confident, started low, a hum that made everyone lean forward. "My friends, we live in a world shaped by God's design. The seasons change, the crops grow, children become men and women just as the Lord intended. But sometimes," he paused, letting his eyes move across the congregation, maybe resting a moment longer on the still figure of Nora Vance, though he never spoke her name. "Sometimes that order gets disturbed. Sometimes things appear that can't be explained, that stand outside God's plan." He talked about the danger of vanity, of trying to stop time, of interfering with what God had set in motion. He spoke of blessings and curses, of the mysterious ways the Almighty might choose to show his pleasure or his displeasure. He never accused anyone directly, but his words painted a picture of something wrong, something that could only be either a sign from above or a warning from below. The air in the church grew thick with fear that nobody spoke out loud. The town, already worn down by war and the daily struggle to survive, now had a new mystery to grapple with. The whispers turned into theories, some about witchcraft, others about divine punishment. The quiet pale girl from the Vance farm was no longer just a quiet pale girl. She had become a symbol, a question mark, a source of growing dread in the heart of Harwick, and the shadow that had started so small now stretched long and dark across the whole community. Dr. Ambrose Holt was a man who believed in science, a voice of reason in a town that often leaned on superstition instead. His office sat in a small, well-kept building just off the main street, and everything about it reflected his orderly mind. Inside, the air carried a faint smell of carbolic acid and dried herbs, a mix of modern medicine and old-fashioned remedies. His instruments, simple by today's standards, were laid out with care. Shiny scalpels, a polished stethoscope, glass bottles holding different tinctures, and a microscope that let him see into a world most people didn't even know existed. He kept a small leather journal on his desk, its pages filled with careful notes, diagnoses, and the occasional question he couldn't answer. Dr. Holt had trained in Philadelphia, a city far removed from the dusty roads of Harwick, and had come back to his home state with a firm belief in observation, logic, and facts you could prove. He was a quiet man, thoughtful and deliberate, his brow often wrinkled in concentration. He treated everything from the common cold to the serious fevers that swept through town with the same dedication to finding the real cause. People respected him, even if they didn't always understand him, and they often preferred Reverend Tate's comforting words over the cold facts of science. It was late summer in 1875, with the whispers about Nora growing louder, when Elias Vance came to see Dr. Holt himself. He arrived at the office in his usual silent way, face expressionless, posture stiff. He asked for a full examination of his daughter, saying in a flat voice that the child seemed to be developing slowly, and there were rumors going around. It was a move meant to stop the talk before it got worse, to offer a medical reason for what the town saw as an oddity. Dr. Holt agreed. His professional curiosity sparked. He had heard the whispers, of course, but had put them down to small-town gossip. Probably exaggerated and not worth much. He expected to find a slightly underdeveloped girl, maybe not getting enough food or dealing with some long-term illness, nothing more than that. The examination happened a few days later in the quiet, clean space of Dr. Holt's office. Nora sat on the table, her small feet hanging down, her hands folded in her lap. She was still, as always, in a way that made you pay attention. Her blue eyes following Dr. Holt's movements with an intelligence that felt almost too old for her. Elias stood in the corner, a silent presence that seemed to fill the small room even though he never moved. Dr. Holt started his examination step by step. He measured her height, barely 4'8", the size you'd expect from a girl of 10 or 11. He weighed her, just 75 pounds, light as a bird. He noticed the fine, almost see-through quality of her skin, the complete lack of any blemishes that come with adolescence. He checked her teeth, small ones with no sign of wisdom teeth yet, the kind you'd see in a younger child. He felt her bones, the delicate structure of her wrists and ankles and ribs. Nothing suggested the kind of growth spurt a girl her age should have gone through. Then he moved to more private observations, keeping his professional manner in place, even as a sense of unease started building in him. He noted the complete absence of any secondary sexual characteristics. Her chest was flat, her hips narrow, her body showing none of the changes that marked the start of puberty. Her voice, when she answered his questions about how she felt, was soft, high-pitched, and childlike. She told him she had never had a monthly cycle, never felt any of the changes other girls her age talked about. Dr. Holt's frown deepened with every new finding. He asked Elias about Nora's diet, her daily habits, her health history. Elias gave answers that sounded almost rehearsed: good food, regular sleep, no serious illnesses since she was little. He talked about Nora's quiet nature, how she loved to read, her delicate health. When the examination ended, Dr. Holt found himself deeply confused. Medically speaking, Nora presented as a girl of 10 or 11, maybe 12 at the very oldest. But Elias had said clearly that she was 14. The difference was impossible to ignore. It didn't fit any medical book he knew, any understanding he had of how the human body develops. He wrote in his journal that night, his normally neat handwriting showing a slight shake. Patient Nora Vance, age 14 according to father, apparent age 10 to 11 years, height 4'8", weight 75 pounds, skin fine, pale, no adolescent changes, teeth consistent with younger age, no secondary sexual characteristics. General health seems delicate, but no clear signs of illness, no reported monthly cycles. Observations suggest developmental arrest, cause unknown. No obvious disease. Patient is quiet, cooperative, intelligent. IIS. Father present throughout. Manner controlled, precise, detached. An unsettling case. Requires more observation. A deep anomaly. The uneasy feeling he couldn't shake wasn't just professional frustration. It was something more basic. A sense that something was deeply wrong. Something that went beyond medical mystery. It was the feeling of looking at a puzzle with pieces missing and knowing with cold certainty that those pieces hadn't been lost by accident, but had been taken away on purpose. The rational part of him tried to match facts with what he couldn't explain. The man in him felt a cold dread settling into his bones, a sense that he was only starting to glimpse a darkness he didn't yet fully understand. To really understand what drove Elias Vance, you have to go back into the shadows of his past, into the grief and loss that had twisted him into something else. Before the war, Elias had been a different kind of man. A proud landowner, a devoted husband, someone whose stern exterior softened whenever he was near his wife Clara. Clara Vance was, by every account, a woman of delicate beauty and gentle spirit. Her hair was the color of moonlight, her eyes a deep knowing blue, and her laugh, though rare, was said to sound like small bells ringing. She was the center of Elias's world, the thing that kept him steady when everything else felt uncertain. Nora, their only child, was born in 1861, just as the first sounds of war started shaking the country. From the moment she was born, Nora was her mother's mirror. As she grew, the resemblance became almost strange. The same fine features, the same light hair, the same striking blue eyes. For Elias it was a deep joy, a living reminder of his love for Clara. Then the war came. Elias, a man who believed in duty, answered the call and left his young wife and baby daughter behind. He marched with the Confederate forces, going through brutal campaigns, endless marches, the terrible slaughter of battles that turned fields into graveyards. He saw things that couldn't be unseen, watched men he knew fall, felt the cold grip of fear and despair. The war stripped away his innocence, his hope, and slowly, piece by piece, began to wear down his humanity. He came home in 1865, not to a hero's welcome, but to a silence that cut deeper than any battlefield noise. Clara had died in 1863 while Elias was still fighting in Virginia. Not from a bullet, but from consumption, the disease that took so many during those hard years. She had faded away, leaving behind a grieving town and a confused 2-year-old Nora. Elias returned to an empty house, a ghost of the home he had left. The light was gone from his life, leaving him lost in a grief so deep he couldn't find his way out. In the parlor of the Vance farmhouse, above the cold fireplace that never got used, hung a large, beautifully painted portrait of Clara. It showed her at 14, a young woman on the edge of adulthood, her beauty shining, her eyes full of the promise of youth. Elias would stare at that portrait for hours, his eyes fixed on the image of his lost love, a silent conversation with a past he could never get back. And as Nora grew, the resemblance to that portrait became almost too much for him to bear. At 10, then 11, then 12, Nora was the living image of his lost Clara, a precious and fragile echo. That resemblance became for Elias both a comfort and a torment, a constant reminder of what he had lost, and a desperate, growing need to hold on to the only piece of her that remained. The first small signs that something deliberate, something deeply unnatural was happening started to surface in bits and pieces from people who had once been close to the Vance household. Old Mr. Abernathy at the general store, a man whose memory was as long as his beard, remembered seeing Elias Vance at odd hours, not in town, but down by the creek that ran through the woods near his property. Elias would be carrying a small woven basket, his head down, his movements secretive. He seemed to be collecting something, not berries or mushrooms, but small plain plants with dull green leaves and thin stems. Mr. Abernathy hadn't thought much of it at the time, probably just gathering herbs for some home remedy. People did that sort of thing. But the memory, once stirred up by the whispers about Nora, now took on a much darker shade. Then there was Clem Dudley, a big, quiet man who had worked as a farmhand on the Vance place for a few years after the war before moving on to find better pay. Clem, not someone who got easily rattled, remembered a strange, bitter smell that would sometimes come from the Vance kitchen. It wasn't cooking, and it wasn't cleaning. It was an earthy, sharp smell, almost like medicine, but with something underneath that made his nose wrinkle. He had seen Elias in the kitchen a few times, bent over a mortar and pestle, grinding something into a paste. Elias would always stop when Clem came in, his back going stiff, his movements suddenly casual. Clem had put it down to Elias being odd, just another part of the man's grief-stricken personality. But now, that memory of the smell and the secret grinding sat in his stomach like a cold stone. And then there was Nora herself. The way she always seemed tired, her unnatural paleness, how her delicate skin looked almost see-through. She was always quiet, always did what she was told, never complained. Even when Elias made her drink a certain herbal tea every morning or eat a spoonful of thick dark paste with her meals, she never argued. Elias would watch her, his eyes intense and unblinking, as she swallowed it without question. He told her it was for her health, to keep her strong, to protect her from the sickness that had taken her mother. And Nora, innocent and trusting, did as she was told. She was just a child, and her father was her whole world, the only one who kept her safe in a world that had already taken everything else from her. The pieces were there, scattered like fallen leaves, waiting for someone with the mind and the courage to gather them up and see the horrifying picture they made. If this story is already making you uneasy, good, because what Dr. Holt was about to find out would challenge everything he believed about medicine, about fathers, and about love. Hit that like button to help more people find this story, and let's keep going. The summer of 1879 brought more than just the crushing Alabama heat. It brought a new kind of unease rippling through the quiet life of Harwick. Thomas Greer, a young man of 19, was a familiar and well-liked face around town. He was the blacksmith's son, a strong boy with an easy smile, messy brown hair, and a natural charm that made people warm to him. Thomas had all the energy of youth, eager to make something of himself, and like most young men his age, his thoughts were starting to turn toward love. His attention, to the surprise of many, had settled on Nora Vance. It wasn't her liveliness that drew him, because Nora had very little of that. It was her quiet mystery, her delicate beauty, and the deep sadness that lived in her blue eyes. He saw her as something fragile that needed protecting, and maybe a little light in her life. He had first really noticed her at the annual church picnic, one of the rare times Elias let Nora leave their property. Nora, who by the calendar was 18, still looked no older than 12. But Thomas, with the romantic ideas of youth, looked past the physical oddity. He saw her gentle nature, her quiet intelligence, and the haunting beauty that made her seem like something from a story. Their meetings were short, secretive, and filled with the tension of something that wasn't supposed to happen. Thomas would find reasons to be at the general store when he knew Elias and Nora might be there. He would give a polite nod to Elias, then a shy, hopeful smile to Nora, and sometimes, just barely, she would smile back, a small warmth in her usually still face. Once he dropped a bright ribbon near her feet, pretending it was an accident. Nora picked it up, her thin fingers brushing his as she handed it back, and for one moment their eyes met in a way that said more than words could. Another time he found her sketching by the creek, a rare moment when she was alone. He came up quietly, offering a few wild daisies he had picked. Nora took them, a faint pink touching her cheeks, and for a few minutes they talked in low voices, like they were sharing a secret. Thomas told her about his dreams of growing his father's business, of seeing places beyond Harwick. Nora, in her soft whisper, talked about the books she read and the stories she imagined. But these small meetings didn't go unnoticed by Elias Vance. His hold on Nora had grown tighter over the years, hardening into something unbreakable. Every glance, every whispered word, every small smile felt like a threat to the careful world he had built around his daughter. He saw Thomas Greer not as a young man with honest feelings, but as a danger, someone who would take away the last piece of Clara that Elias clung to with everything he had. One heavy afternoon, Elias saw Thomas talking to Nora outside the general store, a bunch of wildflowers in his hand. The scene, innocent as it was, lit a cold fire in Elias. his usually expressionless face twisted into something ugly with rage. He walked toward them, stiff and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Thomas in a way that made the young man flinch. "Nora." Elias's voice was low, calm in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. "We're leaving." He didn't look at Thomas, didn't acknowledge him at all. He just took Nora's arm, gripped tight, and led her away, leaving Thomas standing there with the flowers still in his hand and a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The few people who saw it felt something shift. Everyone knew Elias was protective, but this was darker, more threatening. Then Thomas Greer disappeared. It was a Sunday evening, a week after what happened at the store. Thomas told his parents he was going for a walk, maybe to clear his head, maybe hoping to catch a glimpse of Nora. Old Mr. Abernathy saw him last, walking down the dusty road toward the Vance property, the setting sun throwing long shadows ahead of him. He never came back. The alarm went up the next morning. Thomas's parents, out of their minds with worry, went to Deputy Oren Folk. Deputy Folk was a quiet man who did his job well, his uniform always dusty, his face weathered from being outside. He was good at what he did, dedicated. But someone just vanishing without a trace didn't happen in Harwick, and it shook everyone. Deputy Folk started investigating right away. He put together search parties, sending them through the woods and fields around town, calling Thomas's name until their voices gave out. He talked to everyone who had seen Thomas that evening, writing down every detail. He spoke to Mr. Abernathy, who confirmed seeing Thomas heading toward the Vance farm. So naturally, Deputy Folk went out there. He found Elias Vance on his porch, calmly whittling a piece of wood, with Nora sitting quietly beside him reading. Elias greeted the deputy with his usual reserved politeness. When asked about Thomas, his face stayed blank. "I didn't see anyone, Deputy. Nora and I were home all evening. We keep to ourselves." Nora, when asked, just nodded, eyes down, voice barely there. "I didn't see anyone, sir." Deputy Folk searched the Vance property with Elias giving reluctant permission. He found nothing. No sign of a struggle, nothing dropped, no ground freshly turned. The farmhouse and the land around it were kept too neat, almost unnaturally so. The deputy left frustrated and deeply uneasy. Elias Vance was a strange man, but there was no proof, nothing to tie him to what happened to Thomas. The fear in the community shot up fast, the whispers about Nora now mixed with terrified guesses about Thomas. Had he run off? Had something happened to him? Or had something much worse occurred? The quiet, reclusive Elias Vance, once just an object of pity and distant respect, now became a figure of dark suspicion. His tight control over Nora, his cold manner, his flat denials, all of it fed the growing dread that settled over Harwick like a fog. Dr. Holt felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. Thomas Greer disappearing, along with his own disturbing observations about Nora, pulled everything together into a solid suspicion about Elias. The medical mystery that had confused him now felt tied to something criminal. The pieces were lining up, making a picture far more terrible than anything he had imagined. He knew with cold clarity that he had to dig deeper, to find the truth no matter how dark it turned out to be. What happened to Nora Vance, and maybe to Thomas Greer, depended on it. The disappearance of Thomas Greer, along with his own deep confusion about Nora's condition, pushed Dr. Holt into a careful and relentless search for answers. The scientist in him needed to understand, and the human in him felt a growing urgency to protect Nora from whatever secret Elias was hiding. His office, usually a place of healing, became a quiet workshop of investigation. He spent his evenings going through medical books, guides to plants, and any scientific journals he could find, looking for any rare condition, any unusual plant, any old folk remedy that might explain why Nora had stopped developing. It was slow, frustrating work. Medical knowledge in the late 1800s, while growing fast, still had huge empty spaces. He thought about everything. Strange genetic conditions, long-term illnesses, even some kind of poison from another country. But nothing fit quite right. Nora didn't show any other signs of serious sickness, just the strange and disturbing lack of physical growth. Then a thought hit him. What if it wasn't a disease at all, but something done on purpose? What if Elias Vance, in his twisted grief, was actively doing something to Nora? He remembered the old stories, the folk remedies passed down through generations, some of which used plants that could have strong, if poorly understood, effects on the body. He decided to look beyond regular medicine. He wrote a careful letter, his handwriting neat and clear, to Dr. Leonard Price, a well-known botanist at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. In the letter, Dr. Holt described Nora's case in complete detail. How old she was supposed to be versus how old she looked. The total lack of adolescent changes, her paleness, her quiet way, and the absence of any other disease symptoms. Then he asked a series of questions, wanting to know if Dr. Price knew of any plants native to Alabama or the wider South that could affect human growth or development, especially ones that might stop puberty or slow down physical maturing. He made sure to stress how unusual the case was, hinting that something might be given to her on purpose. The weeks that followed were hard to get through. Dr. Holt kept seeing his patients, doing his regular work, but his mind kept going back to Nora's face, Elias's cold stillness, and the dark mystery of Thomas Greer vanishing. He felt more and more alone, carrying a suspicion he couldn't fully prove yet, a thought that felt both monstrous and terrifyingly possible. Then a letter finally came from Tuscaloosa, the envelope marked with the university seal. Dr. Holt tore it open with shaking hands. Dr. Price's answer was detailed, academic, and completely devastating. He said the case was highly unusual, and after thinking it over carefully, he suggested a particular plant. Lithospermum ruderale, commonly called stone seed or wayside gromwell. He explained that while Western medicine didn't fully understand its properties yet, it had a long history of use among various Native American groups, especially for its effects on fertility. He wrote about tribal women using it to stop menstruation and prevent pregnancy, and how some cultures used it to delay puberty in young girls or even create a state of prolonged childhood. Dr. Price went on to explain that recent scientific studies, though limited, had started to identify certain compounds in the plant that seemed to interfere with the pituitary gland, and, through that, the thyroid. A suppressed thyroid, he wrote, could lead to a range of symptoms: slowed growth, delayed sexual development, tiredness, paleness, and a general slowing of the body's processes. Long-term use, especially during key developmental years, could have deep and possibly permanent effects on physical maturation. The plant, he added, was fairly common in the region, often found in dry open woods and along creek beds. Dr. Holt read the letter once, then again, his hands gripping the paper, so tight his knuckles went white. The words on the page gave a cold scientific explanation for the strange thing he had witnessed. Every symptom Nora showed, her small size, her lack of adolescent changes, her paleness, her quiet, almost tired way of being, suddenly made horrible sense. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Elias Vance wasn't just a grieving father. He was deliberately stopping his daughter from growing. He had been feeding her something systematically to keep her forever young, forever a child, forever the image of his lost Clara at 14. The realization hit Dr. Holt like a punch to the stomach, a wave of sickness washing over him. The intellectual satisfaction of solving a medical puzzle was completely overshadowed by the horror of what it meant. This wasn't an illness. This was years of calculated cruelty dressed up as care. Armed with this terrifying knowledge, Dr. Holt knew he needed more than just scientific theory. He needed confirmation, someone who had seen it happen. His mind went right to Clem Dudley, the former farmhand who had mentioned the strange smell and Elias grinding something in secret. Dr. Holt found Clem that same evening at the local tavern, nursing a glass of whiskey, his face showing the tiredness of a long day's work. Dr. Holt pulled up a chair, ordered a sarsaparilla, and started talking in a low, serious voice, explaining his worries about Nora and the strange things going on at the Vance place. He mentioned the plant, the bitter smell, the paste. Clem, at first careful, and not wanting to speak badly of someone he used to work for, slowly started opening up under Dr. Holt's gentle but steady questioning. He remembered the smell clearly, like bitter earth and something else sharp that made your eyes water if you got too close. He talked about seeing Elias, often late at night, bent over a wooden mortar and pestle in the kitchen, grinding dried plant material into powder, then mixing it with water to make a thick, dark paste. He'd always be real quiet about it, Clem said, his voice dropping to a whisper, and he'd always stop if I came in. But I saw him do it, Doctor, more than once. And I saw him put a spoonful of that paste into Nora's morning tea, or mix it into her porridge. He'd watch her drink it too, real close, like he was making sure she got every drop. Clem also remembered Elias going down to the creek bed, often with a small basket, coming back with bundles of the very plants Dr. Price had described. Small, plain things with dull green leaves. He called it Nora's tonic, said it was to keep her strong like her mama. Clem finished, a shiver running through his big frame. But it always felt wrong somehow. A cold feeling. The pieces weren't scattered anymore. They were all together now, forming a complete and horrifying picture. The scientific explanation, the eyewitness account, the terrible reality of what Elias Vance had been doing. Dr. Holt felt a deep dread, but also a fierce determination. He had the truth. Now he had to do something with it. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark history and hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The worst is still ahead. The confrontation had to happen eventually. A storm that had been building for years was finally about to break. Dr. Holt, armed with the scientific explanation from Dr. Price and the chilling testimony of Clem Dudley, knew he couldn't wait any longer. What happened to Nora and the unanswered question of Thomas Greer demanded action now. He arrived at the Vance farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, the air heavy and still, the silence of the place almost smothering. He found Elias in his study, a small bare room filled with books about history and military tactics, the portrait of Clara, forever 14, looking down from the wall. Elias looked up from his ledger, face empty, eyes showing no surprise at the unannounced visit. He just gestured to a chair, a silent invitation to sit. Dr. Holt chose his words with care, keeping his voice steady even though his hands were shaking slightly. "Mr. Vance," he began, "I've come to talk with you about Nora and about some things that don't add up." Elias closed his ledger, placing it exactly in the middle of his desk. "Things that don't add up, Doctor. I assure you Nora is in excellent health. You examined her yourself." His tone was calm, almost dismissive, a small challenge in his words. "I did examine her," Dr. Holt replied, holding Elias's gaze. "And that examination, along with more research, has led me to a very disturbing conclusion. Mr. Vance, I know about the Lithospermum ruderaale." The name hung in the air, a scientific term that seemed to crack the careful mask Elias wore. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or cold recognition. But it passed quickly. He just leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, posture still rigid. "And what exactly do you know about it, doctor?" His voice was still calm, but there was an edge now, a dangerous quiet underneath. Dr. Holt laid it all out, step by step, keeping his tone clinical. He talked about Dr. Price's letter, what the plant did, the compounds it contained, how it affected the thyroid and pituitary glands, how it was known to stop development. He explained how Nora's symptoms matched perfectly with long-term exposure to the substance. He told Elias about Clem Dudley's account, the bitter paste, the morning tea. He left nothing out, no detail unspoken, no piece of evidence unpresented. When Dr. Holt finished, the silence in the room was complete, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the hall. Elias stayed completely still, his eyes fixed on the portrait of Clara. Then, slowly, he turned his head, his gaze cold and unblinking, meeting Dr. Holt's. "You believe I have poisoned my daughter, doctor?" Elias asked, his voice empty of emotion, almost like they were discussing the weather. "I believe you have deliberately stopped her growth, Mr. Vance." Dr. Holt corrected, his voice steady. "To keep her a child, to keep her as she was." He gestured slightly toward the portrait. Elias smiled then, a thin, cold smile that never reached his eyes. "As she was?" "Yes, as Clara was. You see, doctor, you're a man of science. You understand how the body works, glands and compounds and such. But you don't understand how the heart works. You don't understand loss." He stood up, walking slowly toward the portrait of Clara, his back to Dr. Holt. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost like he was talking to himself, filled with a chilling mix of grief, obsession, and a logic that made no sense, but made perfect sense to him. "Clara," he started, his hand reaching out to gently touch the painted cheek of his wife. "She was everything. The light, the warmth, the very air I breathed. And then the war took her. Not with a bullet, but with a cough, a fever, a slow fading away. I was gone, fighting for a cause that was already lost, and she was dying alone. I came home to an empty house, doctor, an empty echoing tomb. Only Nora was left, a small fragile echo of her mother." He turned, his eyes now burning with an intensity that made Dr. Holt want to step back. "And as Nora grew, she became more and more like Clara. At 14, she was Clara, exactly as she is in that portrait. The same eyes, the same hair, the same delicate features. It was a miracle, doctor. A second chance. A piece of Clara given back to me." His voice dropped, becoming almost a whisper, filled with a twisted kind of tenderness. "But time is a thief, doctor. It would have stolen her from me again. It would have taken that precious image, that last piece of Clara, and turned it into something else. A woman who would grow and change and eventually leave me just like Clara did. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't lose her again." He paused, his eyes moving over Dr. Holt as if he expected understanding, maybe even sympathy. "So I found a way. An old way, a forgotten way. The plants by the creek, the knowledge handed down. I researched. I experimented. I found a way to keep her safe, to protect her from time, from the changes that would have erased Clara's image from her face. I kept her pure, doctor, untouched. Forever 14. Forever Clara." His logic was terrifying in how clear it was, how completely missing any sense of right and wrong. He truly believed he had done nothing wrong. He saw it not as cruelty, but as deep, desperate love. He had preserved his daughter, not for her sake, but for his own, to feed his own endless grief. "You see, doctor," Elias went on, his voice hardening, "I did this for love. A father's love, a husband's love, to keep alive a piece of what was lost. And I will not let anyone take that from me. Not you, not the town, not anyone." His eyes narrowed, a threat hanging unspoken in the air between them. "Some things are best left alone, doctor. For everyone's sake." Dr. Holt felt cold dread seeping into his bones. It wasn't just the confession. The horrible admission of what Elias had done. It was the man's complete and total lack of remorse. He wasn't some raving madman. He was a man utterly convinced he was right. His grief had twisted his view of reality into something monstrous. He had done something unspeakable, and he saw it as sacred. Dr. Holt stood up slowly, his legs feeling heavy, his mind spinning. He had come for answers, and he had found them. But the truth was far worse than any medical mystery. He had looked into the soul of a broken man, and the darkness he found there was absolute. He left the Vance farmhouse shaken to his core. The image of Clara's portrait and Elias's chilling words burned into his memory. The confrontation was over, but the real horror had only just begun. The truth, once it's out, has a way of unraveling everything. Dr. Holt, still shaken from his talk with Elias, knew he couldn't carry this alone. The next morning, with a heavy heart and grim determination, he went to see Deputy Orrin Folk. He laid out the whole terrible story. The scientific explanation of lithospermum ruderaale, the detailed letter from Dr. Price, Clem Dudley's account of Elias making and giving Nora the paste, and finally Elias's own chilling confession, his twisted reasons for keeping Nora a child forever. Deputy Folk listened in stunned silence, his usually calm face slowly showing disbelief and then dawning horror. "You mean he's been poisoning his own daughter, Doctor, to keep her looking like her dead mother?" The words were hard to say, the idea too terrible to fully take in. "Not a poison in the usual sense, Deputy," Dr. Holt clarified, "but something that has systematically stopped her development, her becoming a woman. A deliberate act kept up for years." He then brought up Thomas Greer, connecting the young man's interest in Nora with Elias's possessive rage. "I believe, Deputy, that Thomas Greer's disappearance is directly tied to this. Elias Vance wouldn't allow any threat to what he had created." Folk, now fully convinced by the weight of what he had heard, moved fast. He got a warrant, a serious step in quiet little Harwick, and went back to the Vance property with a small group of men. This time Elias offered no resistance, his face a mask of cold acceptance. He watched, expressionless, as Deputy Folk and his men searched the farmhouse. The search turned up damning evidence. In the cellar, hidden under a loose floorboard, they found bundles of dried lithospermum ruderaale, carefully stored. Next to them, a small worn mortar and pestle, still holding traces of a dark earthy residue. And then, in a locked drawer in Elias's study, they found a small leather journal. It wasn't a diary of feelings. It was a careful record in Elias's neat handwriting, showing the doses, how often he gave them, and Nora's physical responses over the years. Entries like Nora's height unchanged this quarter. Good. Her skin stays smooth. The amount is correct. Or chillingly, a young man, Thomas Greer, showed too much interest in Nora today. Must make sure she stays pure. Will increase the dose slightly for a week. The journal was a cold, clinical record of his monstrous obsession. With the evidence secured, Deputy Folk and Dr. Holt gently but firmly took Nora from the Vance farmhouse. They brought her to Dr. Holt's office, away from her father's smothering presence, for a proper examination without him there. Nora sat on the examination table, her small hands folded, her eyes wide and bright. She was pale as always, but there was a new fragile vulnerability about her now. Dr. Holt spoke to her softly, kindly, explaining in simple words what they had found. He told her about the plant, what it did, how it had stopped her body from growing the way it should. He watched her face, expecting confusion, maybe anger, or the denial of a child. But what he saw was a deep, heartbreaking understanding. Then Nora spoke, her voice always soft, still quiet but carrying a terrible clarity. "I knew," she said, her eyes fixed on something far away, beyond the window. "I knew I was different. The other girls, they grew. Their bodies changed. But mine stayed the same. Father said it was a special tonic to keep me healthy, like Mama. He said Mama was beautiful and I was just like her. And he wanted me to stay that way. She paused, a single tear tracing a line down her thin cheek. I felt tired sometimes and hungry, but not for food. Just tired. But I loved my father. He was all I had. He loved Mama so much. I thought he was keeping me safe. I didn't understand that it was wrong. Her confession wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of quiet, deep grief. She had known, in her innocent, childlike way, that something wasn't right, but her love for her father and her dependence on him had kept her from seeing what he was really doing. She had been a prisoner of his grief, a living monument to his lost love. Her own life, her own growth, sacrificed to his obsession. Her acceptance. Her terrible, quiet acceptance of what had happened to her was more devastating than any anger could have been. She was a child who had been denied her childhood, a woman who had been denied her womanhood, all by the hand of the man who said he loved her most. The question of Thomas Greer, though never directly answered by Elias, hung heavy in the air now, a silent and chilling implication. The journal entry. The increased dose after Thomas showed interest. The complete lack of any trace of the young man, and the plant material found near the creek where Thomas was last seen walking, all pointed in one terrible direction. No body was ever found. No definite proof of Elias's direct hand in Thomas's disappearance. But in the quiet, knowing looks between Dr. Holt and Deputy Folk, the truth was understood. Thomas Greer had become another casualty of Elias Vance's monstrous devotion, a threat removed to protect his twisted vision of Nora. The unraveling was complete, leaving behind a landscape of shattered innocence and unspeakable horror. The aftermath of the Nora Vance case sent shockwaves through Harwick, a town already worn down by war and hardship. The legal system in 1871 Alabama, though wasn't built for a crime this strange, this psychologically complex. Elias was arrested, of course, and charged with various offenses related to harming his daughter. But the idea of stopping someone's growth with plants was foreign to the law, and without a body for Thomas Greer, a murder charge couldn't be proven. The trial was a spectacle, drawing curious people from miles around. Elias, true to form, stayed expressionless through all of it, his testimony a cold repeat of his twisted reasoning. He had acted out of love, to preserve his wife's memory, to protect his daughter from the hard realities of the world. Dr. Holt testified, presenting his scientific findings and the journal entries, painting a clear picture of calculated abuse. Clem Dudley gave his account, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and righteous anger. Nora, fragile and quiet, gave her testimony, her soft words carrying the deep sadness of a stolen youth. In the end, Elias Vance was convicted of aggravated assault and child endangerment, but not murder. The jury, made up of townsfolk and farmers, struggled with the unusual nature of the case. Some saw a monster, others a broken man driven mad by grief. He was sentenced to time in the state penitentiary, a punishment that to many felt far too small for the years of physical and mental imprisonment he had put his own child through. The community split apart, some feeling sorry for the grieving widower, others horrified by how far his sickness had gone. The Vance name, once linked with quiet respect, became tied to a dark and disturbing story. Nora, finally free from her father's suffocating control, was a ghost of a girl. Her body, no longer getting the compound, had been changed in ways that couldn't be undone. She was taken in by a distant cousin's family in Tuscaloosa, a kind older couple who gave her a quiet place to heal. The adjustment was hard. Nora stayed withdrawn, her voice rarely above a whisper, her eyes still holding that old sorrow. She had missed years of normal growing up. Years of being with other people, years of just being a child. Dr. Holt, haunted by the case, made one last entry in his journal, his handwriting more thoughtful now than clinical. The Vance case is closed, but its shadows remain. Science gave us the explanation, but couldn't heal the broken spirit. Nora Vance, victim of a love so deep it became monstrous. Her body may slowly begin to catch up, but the years taken, the experiences denied, can never be given back. A chilling reminder that the human heart, in its darkest grief, can twist even the purest intentions into unspeakable acts. The limits of our understanding, both medical and moral, were exposed in Harwick. May God have mercy on her soul and on his. What became of Nora Vance in the years that followed? Her recovery was slow, only partial. As the lithosprimum ruderail slowly left her system, her body began a late, hesitant attempt at growing. She gained a few inches. Her features softened a little, and a small, almost unnoticeable curve started to show. But she never really caught up to how old she really was. She stayed small, delicate, with that unsettling stillness that had always marked her. She lived a quiet life in Tuscaloosa, never marrying, never having children, forever marked by the years of her father's twisted devotion. She carried the scars of her past, not on her skin, but deep inside her spirit, a quiet reminder of the girl who never aged like the others. The unanswered question of Thomas Greer stayed a dark stain on Harwick's history. His disappearance was never fully explained, his body never found. His parents grieved until their last days, always wondering what had happened to their son. The town of Harwick, in its own way, tried to forget. The story of Nora Vance became a whispered legend, a cautionary tale told in low voices around fires, the details changing and growing with each telling. Some chose to remember Elias Vance as a tragic figure, others as a monster. But no one could deny that the quiet little town had witnessed a horror that couldn't be easily explained, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can grow in the human heart when grief and obsession twist together. This story asks us something with no easy answer. What does it mean when cruelty wears the face of love? What do you think of Nora's story? Leave your comment below. If you want more stories like this, dark, true, and impossible to forget, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves history's darkest corners. We'll see you in the next one.